Welcome back to Service to School Stories. I'm your host, Sydney Mathis, Director of Student Success here at Service to School. As a former college admissions officer and the spouse of an active duty service member, I'm excited to dig into topics within the higher education landscape as it relates to veterans and transitioning service members. Let's dig in. All right, everyone. Today I am joined by Dan Savage. Dan is a West Point graduate where he served as an infantry officer for 3 years. After he transitioned out of his time in service from the Army, he went on to pursue a master's in public policy at Harvard, which then took him to a number of places, working in some research fields within Syracuse University's Institute for Veteran and Military Families, a brief stint at LinkedIn, some startup. So really excited to chat with you today, Dan, a little bit more about your journey and your transition out of the military, but also some of the work that you're doing now that I think a lot of our listeners will find helpful or beneficial as they start to consider what their life looks like post-service. So thanks again, Dan.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
For sure. So can you start by telling us a little bit about why you joined the service, your journey going through West Point, and kind of what that transition experience was like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's like an hour-long answer to why I joined the military.
But, give us the short version.
The short answer is just I was always like, I don't know, I was always a patriotic kid. I was just really interested in like American history, and someone gave me a book of the presidents when I was like 7 or something. And I was like, oh, that just like sucked me in. I wanted to learn about all of them. And went on a family vacation to Washington, D.C., sometime around 7, 8, 9 or something. And I think we probably saw the soldiers at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers or something like that. And that just kind of planted the seed in me. I had a teacher growing up where her kid or two of her kids went to the Naval Academy. And so kind of got interested in what the academies were all about at that point. Yeah. But frankly, all the credit to why I actually joined in the end was, my mom at some point when we were thinking about where I wanted to go to college, she actually brought it up and she said, well, you used to be interested in the military. Are you still interested in that? And I said, yeah, let's talk about that. So we looked at ROTC programs, and it just goes to show the influence of mentors in your life. I was on the track team all 4 years in high school, and there was a guy a year ahead of me who was a senior when I was a junior, and he was getting ready to go to West Point. And so I started talking to him about college, and he said, why don't you consider going to West Point? So I joined, it was my cadet basic training started actually 2 months before 9/11. So it wasn't anything about the wars or anything like that. That all came as a big shock to all of us.
Yep.
But yeah, I just kind of wanted to serve my country, and I was really impressed with the academy. I mean, it's very, anyone who's visited, I've never actually been to the Air Force Academy, but I assume it's a similar, the West Point and the Naval Academy both kind of convey this wow, this is an impressive place that I really would love to be a part of, And so once the idea got in my head, I was just kind of like, all right, let's do it.
You're sold. Yeah. That's great.
Sorry, I think there was a second half of your question, but I missed it.
No worries. So you graduate from West Point, go in your time in service. Did you know that you were going to, or did you think at the time, hey, I'm going to make a career out of this, going to do 20 years? At which point did you start to think about transitioning out?
Yeah, I wasn't really sure, to be honest. I mean, so the instructor model at West Point, most of the instructors are captains, majors, lieutenant colonels, or colonels, right? So there's kind of 2 different tours you can do. Like after company command, the Army will pay for you to go back and get a graduate degree and then send you back to West Point as a teacher. And you do that for 2 or 3 years, just like any other sort of Army assignment, and then you kind of go back to the force. Mm-hmm. And so I was interested in that. I had a mentor at West Point that I was exploring what that might look like with. And so I was certainly open to the idea of typically if you do that, you're there for you end up doing a 20-year career or more. Yep. And so that was a strong interest of mine. But once I got on active duty, I started to kind of question, hey, is this, also at that point, there were 2 wars going on, and it was very clear that if I stayed in the Army for a long time, I was just going to keep going back to them over and over and over again. So I think I really actually made the decision, I think probably late in my deployment, which was, I was deployed from August of 07 to October 8 to Baghdad with actually one of the co-founders of Service to School, a very close friend of mine. And I just kind of at that point decided hey, if I keep, again, it's a longer story, but it was the end of '08. President Obama was, then Senator Obama was running essentially on the promise to wind down the war in Iraq, but wind up the war in Afghanistan. And I was kind of like, yeah, I don't really want to spend a whole bunch of time in Afghanistan. Like one war was enough for me. And so I started to sort of think about what was next for me. Had no clue at all professionally what I might like to do. And frankly, to go back to, what I mentioned about West Point, the degree that I would have gotten had I stayed in and gone back to West Point as an instructor was going to be a master's in public policy. And so basically with any like a complete lack of creativity of my own, I just thought to myself, okay, well, I was going to get that degree. I might as well go get it anyways, and I'll pay for it, right? With my GI Bill and student loans. But
Yeah.
My transition plan basically just became go to grad school, like go to the grad school I was hoping to go to before and figure it out when I get there, which ultimately I could have done a lot more planning in advance of that. I mean, it worked out well, but I just kind of like outsourced the whole planning process to like, yeah, I'll just go to school and I'll figure it out from there,
Figure it out later.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I think is kind of the default for some people. But then the other population who are like, okay, well, I'm going to get out and join the workforce. And, I think going back to some of the great research that Syracuse University is doing, they just put out a report this morning. Institute for Veterans and Military Families says that 61% of veterans were underemployed after 3 years post-transition, right? That's 61%. That's a very large number when we're talking about, especially as the number of service members who are getting out and transitioning into, the civilian workforce. Just hearing that 61%, that's a big number. So some of the work that you do now is hopefully in an effort to ease in that transition. Is that right, Dan?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of my, basically the first 10 years post-military working on sort of this transition issue. The 61% number, underemployment is really defined as like employed in a role that you either like demonstrably or you perceive to be below your skill set, right? And a lot of that really happens because people don't do the work to do the planning and really truly figure out, okay, what do I want? What am I good at? Like, where would I be a good fit? Sure. And typically when people are in the military, this isn't a criticism of military service members. Our culture is very insular. Like we do not spend much time. I mean, maybe it's different now. I got out in 2010, right? But at that point, we were not at all talking about like, oh, what's going on in private industry? Like, what might I be interested in outside of this?
Right.
And so there's like, it comes to this point where most people going to that TAP class is actually the first time that they're actually sort of mentally shifting their mindset to, oh, shoot, I actually need to figure out what I'm going to do after this, right? And if you really, I mean, so I've seen this through, thousands of people over the years that have transitioned out that go through this process. And like the ones that I have seen that start the process, even just a brainstorming process 2 years in advance of just starting to think, okay, what's out there? Like, what am I interested in? What would I care about outside of this, right? That's something I really struggled with because the war was so deeply meaningful to me that I was like, damn, what am I going to care about for 60 years after this, And it takes some real time to kind of wrap your mind around all of that, right? So, my own journey, I like I said, I kind of outsourced the planning process to like, well, I'll just figure it out when I get to grad school. And it might have gone, I don't want to frame this as like my transition was a failure because it's worked out quite well, but like it might have gone more smoothly had I gone to like business school or law school where there's like very clear sort of career trajectories out of those, right?
Right.
You go to business school, you're going to be in consulting or marketing or finance or, general management, whatever, right? Like there's like a few core tracks. I don't know what they are for law school, but I assume there's like a few like very common, well-worn paths out of law school. My program, half of the class was international. People came from this really broad, eclectic set of backgrounds that were like people from the Peace Corps, people from the military, people from Teach for America or the World Bank or like nonprofits, or there were some people that were coming from private industry, and so they would all go out to the same, like there was an equal amount of diversity of paths that they took out. And so as impressive as it sounds to say, oh, I went to Harvard, like the career services actually were not that useful because there weren't clear paths. It was like, it was kind of, you have to figure it out for yourself. Like people take this degree and do a whole bunch of things with it. Like you got to figure that out, right? So I kind of was lost at the end of those 2 years. They went by very quickly. And I was interested I had done a summer internship in the mayor's office in Chicago, which is where I grew up. And I just, at some point, I think during that summer, someone recommended like, hey, why don't you poke around and see what's going on for veteran services in Chicago? And I ended up doing my master's thesis on that, like sort of a landscape analysis of like what's all out there, how well is it tied together, how easy or challenging is it to navigate as a service member or as a veteran, right? And that kind of led me to, I mean, my whole career has been network driven, right? So at some point in 2011, actually, right when the Institute for Veterans and Military Families was founded, I was, a professor I was working with introduced me to the founder and said, hey, you should work with this guy in your research. And so when it came to graduation, I said, like the founder is named Mike Haney. He's now the vice chancellor of Syracuse University. And I just shot him an email and I was like, hey, Mike, like, here's my resume. What do I do with my life? Yeah. Like, I have no idea what I'm even good for, And he said, well, I need a chief of staff. Why don't you move to Syracuse? And so I took the leap. I spent 2 years as his chief of staff and then a year doing President Bush's team in Dallas contracted us to do a research project for them. At the time, there was like a ton of money flowing around in the veterans nonprofit ecosystem. You could just like throw the word veteran on your nonprofit and all of a sudden you're raising millions of dollars. Right? And as most politicians, like they didn't want to get into the business. This is not former President Bush, but they didn't want to get in the business of sort of picking winners and losers and deciding like who should get the money or who shouldn't, whatever. Yep. So they basically paid us to do the research, figure out like what is a good veteran, like how do you what's like a framework to think about what's the one I should donate to, or if I am a nonprofit, am I doing this well, or if I'm a veteran, how do I find the right one to go to? So I spent a year doing that, and then that was kind of a finite contract. At the end of that, Howard Schultz's family, the former CEO of Starbucks, I think he's now back to being CEO, but the founder of Starbucks, his family foundation came to us and said, we'd like to pay you to build a veterans employment program, which ended up being the Elmer Opportunity Program, which I think like 20 or 30,000 people go through every year now.
Yeah, it's huge.
And so I spent a year building that, basically flying around the country and, recruiting employers and recruiting military bases and building teams on bases to actually execute the program and whatnot. And that kind of led me into this world of veteran employment. Which again was sort of a stumble. Like I didn't really wake up one day and say like, you know what, employment is the problem I want to help solve.
Yeah.
And after a year of that, I spent 4 years at the Institute. I was kind of ready for something new, different context. And that's when I found out there was an opening for the head of military and veteran programs at LinkedIn. Spent 3 years doing that. And while I was doing that, I was starting to realize like I don't know if this analogy works, but it's kind of like the give someone a fish versus teach them to fish thing. Like telling someone they need a LinkedIn profile is like great. And you can teach them how to make a good, nice, polished LinkedIn profile. But if you're not really telling them like why, if they don't understand what networking is and why they should be using LinkedIn to do research and informational interviews and all that stuff, it's not super effective. And so I spent some time at a venture capital firm and then I wanted to get startup experience. And there's only one venture-backed startup in the military space. Almost every organization in this space is a nonprofit. There's a for-profit called Breakline, which I recommend everyone look at if you're at all interested in the tech industry. They're phenomenal. And Shift is the only venture-backed startup in this space. And so I wanted to get experience at a venture-backed startup, and I ended up there. And that's where I designed a program basically to tackle this very specific issue. Because when I was looking at the market of like, there is no one out there really built like specifically geared towards the I don't know what I want to do with my life question, right?
Yeah.
And it was something I felt so viscerally myself, and frankly do still at like every career transition. I'm like, all right, well, I think I'm ready for something new, but I don't know what's next. This is not a one-time decision. People go through this every single transition. And so I was like, I want to try to help build something to fix this, right? So built a program that was basically 5 weeks to help take people from the I don't know what I want to I've got some idea and I now have the tools for how to actually pursue, like validate that thesis and, pursue that successfully. So left that role back in May, and now I'm kind of doing private coaching and working with startup executives and stuff. But I spent about 10 years basically in the veteran space, and about half of that I would say was really specifically employment focused.
Yeah. So, I mean, just point blank, I mean, when someone says, Dan, I don't know what I want to do with my life, post time and service, where's the first thing you point them to?
Yeah, I mean, there's no pithy answer, right? Like this is like the existential question of your life,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Um, there's a few books, right? So my two favorite books for this specifically, I'll give you the links and you can put them in the show notes. But my favorite book is this book called The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life. It's about 130 pages or something like that. It's a quick read. But there's this guy Boyd Vardy who is a life coach, and he like doubles. He's a life coach in the U.S., but he grew up. He's from South Africa originally, and grew up on this game preserve in South Africa. And I didn't know this until I read the book. But like, if you go on a safari, like the Jeep drives around and finds the animals, and you're like, oh, cool, whatever. There's like a whole thing happening before that where there are people literally walking the land, tracking
And
the animals,
finding the animals.
looking for their footprints, and like, where's a broken twig to indicate that this thing brushed up against a tree or whatever.
Yeah.
And they go spend hours and hours and hours finding the animals, and then they radio back to headquarters, right? And so this guy basically, part of his hobby is on his family's land. He has learned to track animals from like, native generations long, animal trackers. So the book basically is this beautiful weaving of, it's kind of one of those like one chapter about this, one chapter about that kind of thing. And he sort of talks through the process of tracking and finding an animal is actually a beautiful metaphor for like figuring out what to do with your life, because it requires patience, it requires experimentation, it requires the willingness to go down paths that look promising and then realize maybe this isn't where I want to go, right? And then come back. My favorite phrase from the whole book is trackers try things, right? He likes to say that the path of not here is part of the path to here. So nothing is failure. Everything that you're doing that you try, if you learn, hey, I don't like this,
Could be a
learn
redirection.
something, right? You've eliminated options. And so there's just this, the idea also of in the process of tracking an animal, it's not always as clear as like a nice, beautiful print in the mud that's like, oh, look, here's a line. It went that way, right? You have to really, truly be attuned to the quiet signals, right? The little hints here and there of this might be what I'm interested in. And for me, like my path to where I'm at now of like working with, startup executives and stuff, back when I was at Syracuse, I kind of had a hint that I was like, I kind of might be interested in the West Coast. I might be interested in the tech world, and that kind of like when the LinkedIn opportunity came open, I was like, oh, this is a way to try that out, right? It's like veterans plus tech. I can work with that,
Yeah.
And then I got there and had a roommate that was that worked in startups. And I was like, oh man, I think I might be interested in startups, but like, I don't really know what that means or how to, and LinkedIn had an education benefit. And so I used it to go to Stanford for like a certification program in their business school. I call it Stanford Startup School, but it's called Stanford Ignite. It's like a, 9-week part-time thing. And it's just like all those little hints along the way. I was like, you know what? Like the guy I work with now, my business partner, he was my coach when I worked at the VC firm. And there was just this like hint of like, man, stay in touch with this guy. This is a really good person. He's really invested in your success. Like he works with a lot of startups as well. I'm like, maybe this is the right path, right? The venture capital firm itself, when I worked there, I was helping run programs to train, startup founders basically on specifically their like business and leadership skills. But I didn't really enjoy that, like working there that much, right? And so that was all part of this experimentation process. And so this book, The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life, super quick read, but like from a very meta level of like, how should I think about this? I reread this thing like once or twice a year now, just to kind of keep reminding myself like, okay, I'm not quite sure what's next. I'm not quite sure where I want to be. Like, be patient, run experiments.
Right. And I imagine it probably applies to different parts of kind of where you're at through that journey, right? Like rereading it, there might be something that maybe you didn't glean the first time you read it, but now when you read it back the second time, you're like, oh, okay, I can see that in work here.
Yeah. I mean, it's applicable to everything, right? Like, so I went through a breakup back in like May. And I like busted back out the chapter about how like when things don't work out, like that's actually a good thing because you've learned things, right? And so just all of life is this. It's not even just about picking what job you want, but like your path in life, whether it's relationships or your vocation or your educational journey or whatever, it just really requires quite a lot of patience and experimentation. And again, like a willingness to truly be introspective and kind of listen to what are those voices that I'm hearing. That's like that kind of tug of like, I think I'm interested in this, or like, hey, you know what, when I do this, I don't actually enjoy that much, right? It might pay really well, but there might be
Yeah.
something in here that's like not that, it's not really me, right? So from like a super conceptual level, I would say that one book, The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life. A much more practical resource is the book Designing Your Life, which is written by two Stanford professors, where they use design thinking, basically, which is essentially a process of brainstorming, reality testing, and iterating, right? To walk through, okay, how do I start to figure out where I want to be and who's going to help me get there? They advocate for a process of really asking others for help. So you like look to your friends and family to help you brainstorm. There's a bunch of exercises in the book that are actually like super practical exercises around like, idea mapping and like, okay, write down a thing you think you're interested in, and then write down all the words associated with that and all the words associated with those. And like, you start to observe patterns and things like that. So super, super practical tool. But frankly, I would say, the best other two resources are LinkedIn and Veterati. So Veterati just kind of was down for a little while, but they're back online now.
Yeah, I got back up.
If I can take a step back, step one is just this introspection piece, which is like, what do I care about, right? Like most of us, we're very mission driven. Like we wouldn't join the military if we didn't like want to care about the work that we do. We're not like, it's actually quite rare to be so deeply invested in your profession outside of the military, right? And so you have to start looking for signals of like, what else do I care about, right? Like, what else do I enjoy? And it doesn't have to be some bleeding heart social issue, right? It could be, but it could be like, I really enjoy fitness, right?
Yeah.
Well, maybe, ultimately, I don't want to take too many steps down the leaps down the path, but like maybe you end up working as a product manager at Peloton, right? Or at Garmin, or you work at CrossFit headquarters or whatever, right? Like you just kind of start to think about like, what are the parts of my day that like, make me light up? If you're a reader, what are you frequently reading about? Like, do you like documentaries? What are you often watching documentaries about? When you're scrolling through your social media feed of choice, right? Twitter, whatever. Like, what are you definitely clicking on, right? Are you always reading articles about AI? Like, okay, you probably should dig into that, right? Like, just starting to look at the signals. And then two, starting to think about, okay, if I start to frame this as, every organization that was ever created was created to solve a problem, whether it's the military or a government organization or a company or a hospital, whatever. And if you can start to train yourself to look around and start thinking like, well, what problem is this organization solving, right? Then you can start to think about these things I care about. What's the problem set here, right? And like, who's working on that problem? Right. Typically, that's very broad. It's government agencies, nonprofits, startups, philanthropic organizations, big companies, whatever industry they're in. And so you can start to think about, okay, which of those contexts might resonate most with me, right? Some people really like the stability and security of a government job. Some people think that's stifling and they're like, I don't want anything to do with that, right? I want to go be in a startup world. Some people really want the, somewhat chaotic, unpredictable, but very exhilarating, life of a startup world. You want to work maybe at a big company. It's kind of similar to the government in the sense that you got, a bunch of stability, but it's probably going to be a bit more, flexible and a bit, it's going to be a nicer lifestyle. You're going to get paid more, whatever, but perhaps less mission driven, right? And so that's when you start to get to Veterati and LinkedIn, which is like, all right, once you've kind of done that, like, introspection up front, then you just start reaching out to people, and like you have to have the courage to reach out to them and set up an informational interview, which is a very specific term. If I don't know if people talk about that much now in the military, but I had never heard that term before when I was going through my transition. Like just Google how to do an informational interview and there's like tons of articles about them. But like for people like us that don't always know what's out there, you have to have the courage to get yourself out there and just ask people questions. And the more you do it, it's like the first date you ever go on, it's super awkward and you're very self-conscious, right? And like the 20th first date you ever go on, you're just like rolling up going like, okay, I got normal. This. Right. And informational interviews are the exact same, right? And so you want to start asking people like, what do you do? What does that actually mean, right?
Yeah. And how did you get there? And
exactly. Yeah. Like, and so that kind of goes into the school thing. It's like, well, what degree should I get, or should I get one? Do I need one, right? Do I actually need an MBA to get into this field, or do I actually need a bachelor's degree or whatever, right? And so there's a tool on LinkedIn that if you go to any university page, right? So like, let's just type in UCLA, right? If you go to that page, somewhere on that page is going to have a button that says alumni. There's literally a tool where you can see every alum on LinkedIn from that page and like filter them by what they studied in school, what their skills are, what industry they're in. Like, it's insane.
Where they're at now.
Power. Yeah, where they live, who they currently work for, right? And so if you just start to use that, and again, have the courage to reach out to people, it requires also the skill of being really good at cold outreach, right? The ability to send someone an unsolicited message and have that be a compelling enough message that they're going to respond and say, yeah, I'm willing to give you 30 minutes of my time, right? That's a skill to hone as well. That takes practice, which again is why I say you should start this probably 2 years in advance, because you're going to have to screw this up.
Yeah, by the time it's actually time for you to be nailing some of those.
Yeah, exactly. And then you want to get to the place where you're like, okay, your informational interviews, again, should be like a funnel, right? You start really super broad. Okay, where do I think I might be interested in? I don't know much about these fields. So like, okay, I think I've got some sense, right? And you don't need to know, especially if you're going to go to school, like you don't need to know, I want to be in this job at this company, in this specific team at that company, right? You need that if you're going to be applying for a job. But if you're just using this to sort of figure out, okay, yep, I think I do want to go to school. I do think I want to get, a degree. Let's say it's an MBA, or I need a master's degree in my type of engineering or whatever to get to the next level. From there, then you probably want to do some more informational interviews from people that went to the schools that you're considering, and ideally recent graduates who are going to be easier to get to respond to you, right? The more senior someone is, the busier they are and the less likely they are to get back to you. But I say you should look for like near peer informational interviews, like the people that, again, you're not going to be super nervous, like having a conversation with. They probably made an admissions decision like within the last 5 years, probably not too many more, and then you can really ask them about, okay, is this program, basically you're looking for the answer, is this program a fit for me, right?
Sure.
And then from there, you want to start saying, okay, I kind of, I think I kind of know what, like whether you're applying for a job or whether you're writing, admissions essays, at some point you're gonna have to hone the art of storytelling, right? And so that's from there, you got to go, okay, I actually have some conviction around what I want because I've done a bunch of research. It's not just like, oh, how am I supposed to answer this personal statement, that the school is asking me for, but instead you already know the answer. When they ask you, why do you want to go here? Like you've already got it, right? And so you're going to write a much better essay if you've done the work to truly figure out what the answer to that question is, right?
Yeah.
From there, you're really just talking. We could go on for an hour about like storytelling and essay writing and stuff, but like ultimately, a big mistake that our community tends to make is that people are actually super interested in our background. Like, and I don't mean to say that like no one cares you served, but like ultimately, most people don't understand any of the details that you're telling them. And like, frankly, that's not super relevant to the thing that you're applying for, right? Storytelling is almost entirely about the future and why you want to do this future thing and why they are critical to helping you get to, like, the equation should be like you plus me equals my future. And like, how can I tell that story? And the why behind why I want that future, you should really only be talking about the parts of your background that are relevant to that why, right? So if you were a truck driver in the military for 4 years or whatever, and now you want to go be in investment banking, like, why do you want to do that? It might be because you met someone when you were a child that did that career field and you just did the military as a detour, right? Like, that's fine. The story should be about, when I was a kid, I was so interested in this, but I wanted to serve my country and now I'm ready to keep moving towards my dream, right? Like, it doesn't have to be every step of the journey. It's just like, this is the part that's relevant, right?
Sure. There's so many parallels between what you're saying with, being introspective and using that opportunity to kind of be reflective on things that you like and don't like, right? Taking that informational interview and figuring out, okay, maybe Wall Street isn't where I want to be. That's not the work-life balance that I want. And that's one of the best takeaways there. And it's the same thing we tell students, when you have the opportunity to do an internship, if the takeaway there is that you don't like that potential major, well, good thing you're not spending 4 years now studying, biomed or
for student vets that do 4-year programs, I always encourage them, like, every single summer, you should be using your internship to reality test some idea you have about the future.
Right.
Because you get 3 opportunities to try that out, right? And if you get
Yep.
it on the first try and you're like, man, I really like this, then by the third try, you're probably doing an internship with the company you want a
That you want
job
to
with.
be at.
You are lined
Yeah.
up, right?
Yeah.
But
The
yes,
same thing with between, being able to tell your story in an admissions essay. I tell applicants all the time, especially in undergraduate admissions, a lot of their applicants aren't from the military. So
yeah,
your story alone is already unique. It's already going to stand out there.
yeah,
But that same, having kind of the underweaving theme of how either your time in service or your time before service has influenced why you want to do, X as a major,
yeah,
is kind of the same thing. And gosh, I hope one day we get away from cover letters, but it's kind of the same thing
yeah,
that, you could translate into a cover letter there, right?
yeah, absolutely. I think it's, we're so proud often of the work that we've done, right? We're proud of the things that we've accomplished. And like the military does a good job of, I mean, one could argue maybe it's an unhealthy part of the culture as well, that like just looking at someone's uniform, you can sort of stack rank them.
Yep.
But like the military does a good job of like even just visually rewarding us for the things that we've done, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it can be really like, that's actually one of the biggest challenges of the transition process is the whole identity transformation that goes into, I'm no longer Mike the Marine, I'm Mike,
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean? Like, who am I outside of this, right? And you're going to have to wrap your mind around the fact that like some of the things that you're really proud of, frankly, no one cares. Like, that's a really hard thing. I mean, so I was an infantry officer in the Army. Every infantry officer in the Army is expected to go to Ranger School, right? It's like one of the hardest things you can do in the Army.
Mm-hmm.
I was very proud of having gone through, like, gotten my Ranger tab, like you show up to your unit as a lieutenant, the sergeant major kind of like does one of these and looks at your shoulder. Like, obviously at a podcast, you can't see what I'm doing, but like, they kind of like shake your hand and look over to see if you've got one, right? It's like this badge of honor that like, are you really truly an infantry officer or not? No one cares. Like, no one knows anything about what that means outside of our little world. They're like, you mean like a park ranger? Like, you're like the people with the hats, and you're like, no, it was really hard. Okay.
Yeah,
Like,
it was really hard.
please admire me for this thing I did. Right. But like, mostly people don't get like, I mean, being a submariner in the Navy is like a similar thing where like, those people are nuts, man. Like, that's like really hard work. That is a deep commitment to service. That is like,
Yep.
God, how challenging is it to be underwater for God only knows how, I wouldn't do that, right? I'd rather run around Baghdad getting shot at than like being a steel tube underwater forever. But like, that's something that, it's just like, oh, that's cool in conversation, right? And so it's really hard for us sometimes to wrap our mind around like, this new world that I'm entering is a very different world.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, it's almost as jarring as like when you walked into basic training on the first day and you're like, oh, damn, like, all the rules I thought were not the rules anymore. Like, it's not quite like that because no one's going to be shouting at you, but it is an equivalent
Let's hope not.
change in mindset and culture and everything. And we have to have the humility to accept the fact that like we made a choice to do something very different than society,
Mm-hmm.
and we are making a choice to go back to society. And
Yeah.
we have to own the consequences of that choice, which is that people aren't necessarily going to understand that thing that we did. And we have to accept that, right?
Yeah. Or even, I mean, I talk to applicants sometimes, especially in my work, I work with a lot of our enlisted population and, a lot of E3s, and they're like, well, I don't really have anything, flashy to add on my application here. And it's like, guess what? This is your opportunity where that doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Kind of like what you were saying, like, you're not going to wear your uniform to class. No one's going to have any idea. Which also brings up another point I'd love to hear you kind of talk about, is translating that military experience into civilian equivalency. So either on a resume or in an informational interview or even in a real interview. What are some tips or resources that you have for our listeners around that?
Well, I think it's all about where you're like, I often think of things in terms of like what's my frame of reference and what's someone else's frame of reference, right?
Mhm.
When you're communicating to someone, or even just when you're thinking about writing a resume, right? Our frame of reference is, this is my background. I want to put this background on a piece of paper, right? Like I have to find a way to articulate what my background is. This highlights the importance of the research, right? Even if it's just understanding what is relevant to an admissions committee versus what's relevant to a potential employer, it's okay, how do I selectively choose the things from my background that are going to be compelling to these people, right?
Mhm.
I'm just trying to think, like the first job interview I had, right? First semester in grad school, we were interviewing for summer internships, and like I was talking to a consulting firm. And this guy seemed to have interviewed military people before because he was very good at like coaching me through the interview, right? Um, and ultimately he was like, tell me about a problem that you solved, like an organization that you were in that was like a problem
Yep.
that you like identified the problem, created and executed a solution, right? And like, yeah, there could have been, I could have picked a million stories from the stuff that I was actually proud of, which was like, yeah, this one time in Baghdad, I was assigned an Iraqi platoon to work with me and I figured out how to make it work and we did the mission and it went really well, right? Like
Mhm.
that doesn't actually matter to that guy. He's thinking about like process improvement and human capital
Yeah.
management and all this stuff. And I sat there and I thought about it and I was like, okay, yeah. So in my last job in the military, the odd thing about being a West Pointer is you serve for 5 years. And so like your kind of natural assignment life cycle ends at 4. And if you're leaving, they kind of have to find a place to stash you for a year, right? So I was doing this like office job in a general's headquarters, right? And like I was analyzing spreadsheets and like figuring out, okay, hey, there's like this turnover problem with our people and like training isn't exactly aligned and like people are like there's not a lot of effective knowledge transfer between
Mhm.
people and departments when they leave. And like it's a long story, but I created some system and program and whatever to like, fix all of that, right? He didn't care that I kicked down a bunch of doors in Baghdad, right? Like that's not going to give me the job. You look for the thing that you might find as the least part important or least interesting part of your background, but you have
Mhm.
to understand the frame of reference of the person that you're talking to and say, okay, what's the skill set that they're hiring for, or for school, what's the skill set that they're looking for, right? What's the type of background that they're looking for, and you kind of have to learn to become. I don't know if chameleon is the right analogy because you're not like changing yourself to match their background, but like you're
Sorry, but you have
picking
to
the
be
part of
agile
yourself
in
out.
the right.
Yeah. And so I always say if like 5% of your background is speaks to the thing that they want, right? The 100% of the things you should be talking about is that
Is that
5%
5%?
of your
Yeah.
background, right? And so it really just all goes to walking into whether it's any meeting, a conversation, any interview. Life is all about preparation. It's like the more thought you put into something before you do it, the more successful you are afterwards. And so if
Mhm.
you can even just take an hour to go like look at that person's, if you know who's interviewing you, which you should if it's an actual job interview, right? Um, like spend some real time digging into that person's LinkedIn profile and look them up on Twitter and see, like Google them and see if there's news articles that feature them. Have they been interviewed? Have they been on a podcast? Right? Like
Yep.
if someone were interviewing for a job with me in the future, I kind of would expect that they, if it was a vet at least, I kind of would expect that they had like scrolled down on my LinkedIn profile and been like, oh, I saw that you did a bunch of work with veterans. Like that looks like it was really interesting. Whatever. Like find a way to bring it into
Sure.
conversation, right?
Something common. Yeah.
Pick something about them that you can then talk to and make,
Mhm.
your, I'm on a bit of a riff here, but like people hire people they like. People hire like
Yeah. It's that
people they
personality
see as
factor.
one of them, right?
Yeah.
There's a, maybe I'll give you, this is a little bit of it's a very conceptual, like the value of this article is very conceptual, but there's this guy, he's a marketer, Seth Godin, who writes a bunch, and he wrote this piece called People Like Us Do Things Like This. And it talks about the power of this concept of people like us, right? You in your mind have some us that you're a part of, right? And you may not explicitly know that or label that, but you make your purchasing decisions based off of that. You decide what neighborhood to live in based off of that. You decide what car
Mhm.
is appropriate for you and your income level because you don't want to look poor, but you also don't want to look too flashy, right? Everything that we do is woven into this like concept of there's this like people like me do things like this, right?
Mhm.
And if you can get yourself into the mindset of how does this person, how does this profession, how does this category of people see themselves and what's relevant to them, like what do they care about? You can start to figure out how to frame your background in a way that's actually going to be really resonant, right?
Yeah.
Like again, they might not care about you being in a submarine, but they might care about like one of the projects that you did while you were there. And like you really have to put some thought into like, okay, well, do people in this field actually need a PMP? Like, are they looking for people who have accounting backgrounds? Well, like you might not have been an accountant in the military, but like, is there something that you did that's relevant to that? Like find that thing,
Right.
find a way to weave that in a conversation, because when they're talking to you, if you're framing yourself as the outsider trying to get into their world, right? I'm this military person, I'd like a job with you. They're not hiring military people who want a job with them. They're hiring people like them who are qualified for that role, right? And
Mm.
so you have to demonstrate, like the me that you bring to that conversation is I'm one of you. And you
Right.
have to show them I'm one of you. I belong in
You
your
are.
organization already, right?
Yeah.
Not I've got this crazy, I'm not asking anyone to hide their background, but like if you come at this from, this is also why no one should ever have their uniform on in a profile picture on LinkedIn, because people don't hire that. Like that's not what people wear to work where I go to work, like, so
Yeah.
you just have to kind of get yourself into the mindset of like, how do I make myself feel like, to my audience, right? Like I'm one of them, right?
Yeah.
When I'm talking to you, I'm going to talk about my nonprofit experience. I'm going to talk about the veteran stuff, right? If I
Mhm.
go, I mean, literally yesterday, I spent a couple hours in with a private equity firm because we're building like a talent development program for some of the folks that are like the leaders of their portfolio companies, right? My military experience never comes up. I talk about the work I did at a startup. I talk about the work I did at a venture capital firm. Like I try to find ways to use language that's going to resonate with them.
Yeah. I think
And
that's big.
it all is like whoever I'm talking to, the story of me is a different story, right?
Mhm.
Because there is
Just
no
different,
one
just
unified
other
story.
parts of who you are.
Yeah, exactly. There's no like that's why I was just, like there's a dozen stories of you, right?
Right.
It could, if I were to ask you to tell me your life story, you could tell me every job you ever had. You could tell me every place you've ever lived. You could tell me every sport when I was a kid, I started playing soccer when I was whatever, and then I ended up on the Olympic team, right? Like that could be a life journey that's entirely separate from, yeah, I've got kids, or maybe I'm really religious, or I had some like religious awakening at some point in my life and that totally changed everything, or whatever, right? Like when we think about what's your story, we're so ingrained in the idea that like I am this body in a uniform. Our story is like, oh yeah, I enlisted when I did whatever, and then I was on a torpedo man's mate on a submarine and blah. And like, that's not you. That's a thing you did,
Right.
right? And that's such a hard thing to get people like. It's very easy for me, 12 years out or 10 years, to say this. It's a very long process of sort of rewiring yourself to not just be like, I'm this person in this uniform, but instead like actually understanding what are my tastes, what are my hobbies, what do I like outside of this?
Yeah.
But our culture is it's just so demanding. It demands your entire existence. It
Mhm.
literally, I mean, right? Like we're asking you to potentially die for this, right? So you're going to be fully invested in this thing. It's not a criticism. It's just simply that's just the nature of that career path, right?
Yeah.
Like by choosing that path for your life, you have essentially, stepped out of a whole bunch of other options. And it takes a long time to sort of say, okay, I'm not doing this one anymore. What are the other ones that I want? And like, how much or how little do I want the military to be a part of my identity in the long run?
Mhm. Yeah. And I think that is just such an important part of thinking, what does either that workspace look like or that major look like? So many of my conversations, applicants say, oh, well, I didn't do anything like that in the Army. It's like, perfect. Let's dig
Yeah.
into that a little bit more. And, how did you come to that space to be able to say, I'm ready to put that behind me and, like dig into something else that I'm genuinely interested in? We
Yeah.
had an applicant recently admitted to University of Michigan. He's going and doing theater. I don't know all of the different MOSs, but I'm
Yeah.
almost positive he did not do
Yeah.
anything theater related in his time in service. So just, leaning into those, small voices, like you said in the beginning, and following that, because too, that's honestly going to make for a better admissions essay when it's
Yes.
something genuinely
Yeah.
interesting to you. And it's going to come through more natural in an interview,
Yeah. Yeah, I think I mean, again, we could do hours on storytelling. Like there's a part of this that's like how much of my background is like super relevant to these people. There's also an art to picking the story that's totally not relevant and finding a way to show them how it is relevant for them to see like, wow, this person can think outside the box, or this person like is quite agile, right? And so if you're thinking about, if someone asks you an interview question, I mean, this is like PhD level storytelling to get to the place where you're like, okay, I've nailed it. Like they get that I belong here. Now I'm going to start to throw out this one time in Iraq stuff, like, but those are the things that make you interesting as well, right? So it sounds like potentially conflicting advice, like don't talk, like find the thing that's going to make you fit in, but also find ways to like also make yourself interesting, right? Because you want to stand out from other candidates. It's again, I've been at this for like 12 years. So it takes a long time to really start to figure out those nuances of like, yeah, what stuff is like just out there enough that people are like, oh, that's cool. They get it. So it's not like something they've never heard of, right?
Right.
But
But then you don't
also,
lose them getting too far into the weeds.
exactly. I don't want them to like this phrase, like, I don't want to other myself, right? I don't want to unintentionally show them I actually don't belong, right? And that's a whole, I mean, my career has been so like between like the nonprofit work I did at Syracuse, we had funders that were the top people at JP Morgan Chase, right? So you'd go, I'd be on Wall Street, like, I mean, technically they're on was it Madison Avenue, Park Avenue? But like, essentially you're quote unquote on Wall Street, like dealing with these like super rich banker folk, and you start to realize like, okay, this is the stuff that resonates with them.
Yeah,
And then
this
you
is
go
what
to
they
a
want to
government
hear.
office. Yeah. And you talking about government stakeholders trying to get the Department of Defense to do a partnership with you or something. And like, they care about completely different things than the bankers do, right? And it's just taken a long time for me to like be in a bunch of different types of environments to start to really understand, okay, with this type of person, this is the type of language I should be using. Perhaps even this is the way I should dress, right? You want to probably look a little more polished when you go with the bankers. I don't want to say you want to look like raggedy when you go to the government people, but there's a way of looking too flashy for them, right? And they're like, who's this hotshot? Like, so you don't wear the same suit to Wall Street that you do to the Department of Labor, right? And that's a long process of starting to figure out, again, like putting your service in the context of your broader life and making it make sense to you. So you're like, okay, I'm proud of that. That was a part of who I am. I'm going to leverage it when I want to, when it's useful. I'm going to find ways to honor that and like stay, frankly, Gus, who we mentioned before, who is one of the board members of Service to School. He's the strongest tie I still have to the military community now that it's not my profession anymore, and he's the only person like I text stupid military memes to and stuff, it's like, oh, did you see this happened or whatever. And so there's still like a seed of that in my life, but a lot of my life has moved on from that now.
Sure.
So it all sort of, it's at the very beginning, it's just figure out, like, do your very best to do the research to understand, what kind of people do I vibe with, right? When you're doing these informational interviews, like you want to meet several people from a specific career path, or if you're getting to a point where you're talking about a specific company, several people from that company to kind of get the, feel for like, yeah, these are the kind of people I would want to spend my time with or be around, or like really try to figure out if you're doing informational interviews with people at schools to understand, like, is this again the kind of vibe I want to be in for 2 to 4 years, right? Or if you're doing a PhD, even 6, right? Like that's a huge commitment to, I mean, hell, if you enlisted and you served for 4 years and then you pick a 4-year undergrad program, that's the equivalent amount of time that you were in the military. Like, you really want to think about, like,
where you're going to be for 4 years.
Am I going to like this? Like, is this do I want to be around these people for 4, it really requires thought, and I think that we often look at our background and we think like, oh, the military makes us leaders and like we're so, we're these like immensely capable, whatever. And in so many contexts we are. But the fact that in order to make you able to solely focus on your combat role, the military automates essentially every other part of your life, puts sometimes us in this like mindset of like, okay, I just need to kind of get my assignment and get to my job, and like then I'm going to do it well. And there's almost an autopilotness to it, right? Like, someone is going to call you, whether it's a branch manager, if you're an officer, or like a career counselor or whatever, if you're enlisted, someone is going to check in with you and say like, okay, your time here is about up. Like, these are your three options, right?
Yeah.
And the blessing and the curse of civilian life is you could literally choose any school that you want to go to, and any major that you want, and any profession that you want. And it's like, it's freeing, but it's also somewhat crushing sometimes when you're just like, this is literally, they call it the paradox of choice, right? There's like too much out here to pick from, and you end up debilitated by the inability to pick a thing, right?
Yep.
When you pick an MOS in the military, like that does kind of define you for a very long time. I always encourage people, like, do as much research as you can before you commit to a degree program or, your first job. But also, like, you get a mulligan out here. Like, if you don't like what you're doing, do something else, right?
Yeah.
Have the
I think I
courage
saw
to say,
recently that it was like transitioning service members or veterans spend usually like 2 or 3 of their first jobs
yeah,
before they actually find the one that kind of like feels like the best fit for them.
yeah. Because if it takes that long to like get it, to figure out like who you are and what you want, right? It's this process. I don't know if this metaphor resonates, but in the Army with like, like artillery or mortars or whatever, there's like someone with the binoculars calling in, and they always miss the first time, right? At least in training, they do this on purpose, right? And so they miss with the first shot, and you go like, essentially aim left more or aim right more or whatever, and they miss with the second shot, but they're closer, right? And every shot you take, you get to kind of adjust, and you're like, oh, okay, we're getting closer. Just keep refining the approach a little bit, right? That's basically this whole process. Like, you fire a round downrange, it's probably not going to hit. Like, be realistic, but you're not going to find your dream job on your first try. Like, that would be amazing if that happened, right?
Yep.
You're going to have to fire a shot, see where it lands, and go, okay, I think I kind of want to move this way a little bit, right? Maybe it's you pick your issue that you really care about, and you're like, you know what, I'm going to try doing this in the private sector. And you get there and you're like, you know what, these people, like, yeah, I'm like, conceptually we're working on this mission, but these people aren't as committed to this maybe as I would like to be. The pay is nice, but I don't actually care that much, whatever. Okay, you adjust fire, find a way to work on that same mission, but for some nonprofit or for a government agency, something like that, right? And it's just this iterative process of like, try something out, see how it goes, have the courage to make a change. But like, you are not at all on a conveyor belt. Like, no one is going to call you and say, okay, the next step is this, like,
Yeah.
now that you've got this degree, you actually need another one, or, hey, you're underpaid compared to your peers, or
yeah, no one's definitely going to say that.
right? Like, no, it's all on you to figure that out. And so I think, because there's like assumed fairness in many ways in the military, that like, yeah, everyone's getting paid the same. I can look up Sergeant so-and-so is an E7 with 17 years in the military or whatever. Like, I can go to like Google that and boom, I've got their pay, all those things. You just truly have, again, this is like an identity shift. This is a mindset shift of like, I'm in the driver's seat and I need to be the author of my own story. I'm not just a character in this book, right? And that takes a lot of courage to do, to say to yourself, okay, I'm unhappy here. What am I going to do to make a change, right?
Oh yeah.
And that's why, like, that's why I keep rereading this Lion Tracker's book, like the design your life thing. Literally, the whole concept of design thinking is it's circular. Ultimately, like you get the context, you brainstorm your reality test, you put things out there, and you continue to iterate. But like, you're just going to keep going in that circle essentially till you die, because like, you're going to be different every couple years. You will have changed. And so the thing you signed up for is not going to meet your needs anymore. Like, that's just the definition of this, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, you do your best with the research, and you're going to miss. You're going to get like,
and be okay with that miss, right?
Yes.
Like, there's some reassurance in hearing, I think, for our listeners, that it is okay to miss,
Oh yeah.
to go
Yeah.
back to the drawing board, but to be insightful enough to look back at that miss and figure out what you can take from that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
I
Dan,
like to
as
think of
we
it.
go
Sorry,
ahead.
I was gonna say I like to when I try to be very real with people that are transitioning and like, yo, this is hard. Like, you're gonna get it wrong a couple of times. You're gonna be frustrated. You're probably gonna be lonely. You're probably gonna have some experiences where you feel really like upset about the fact that like people don't really seem to care about certain things that you're really proud of, right? Like, it is a hard process to go through. And the reason, one of the things I like to say when I'm talking to people about this is like, if you think about, whatever, you go to the doctor, you get a new prescription. And on the bottle, it says like side effects, dizziness and nausea, right? You start taking the pill and like 3 days later, you're dizzy and you're nauseous. Like, you might not remember that it said on the label, you're going to be dizzy and nauseous, right? But if you can remember that, you're like, okay, this isn't like a whole big crisis. Like, this is a side effect of this
This
thing.
is expected. Yep.
It doesn't make it frankly suck any less when you're going through that, right? You're still dizzy and nauseous, but at least you've got some mental clarity of like, okay, like this is just part of this process. And like, I'm doing this to make myself feel better. Like, I'm doing this to get myself to a better place. And like, I just kind of know, because if you're feeling those side effects, right? All those things we just talked about, and you start beating yourself up and you say, I failed. I did this wrong. I must not be doing this well enough. Like, everyone else seems to be having an easier time than I am or whatever. Like, that's the hard part, is if you get in your own head and you're like, man, I'm a screw up. The reality of the situation is you are not. There's like 2.5 million post 9/11 veterans who've gone through this in the past 20 years. There's like 22 or 25 or something million veterans that are living in the United States. Every single person who wore a uniform and then stopped had to go through some period of friction. And if you understand that, just have some patience with yourself and have the courage to keep trying and keep iterating. And that's ultimately like the best thing you can do, right?
Yeah, that's honestly, as we wrap up the conversation today, that I think is one of the best and most important takeaways, is that even if it's changing your major or leaving that job that you thought was the one, that you're not a screw up, that it is just an opportunity to, redirect and figure out, what can I take away from this experience and apply it to the next one. So you don't have that same, screw up or hiccup. So Dan, any last piece of advice for our listeners that might be considering transitioning out of the military?
Yeah, I mean, I think, really just what we just said, but like just to reiterate it / phrase it in one different way. In the military, there's this phrase, at least in the Army, right? I've only got one brain's worth of experience, but like, I assume this is similar across. There's people always say what right looks like, right? Like, there's always a definition of correct. There's always some manual or something that's like, what is the way this should be done? And that is needed in that context, right? Like, if you're like I spent a lot of time thinking about this, like within the chaos of war, right? Like, we have to have some really clear certain things that we all know work the same way so that everything isn't chaotic. We have to minimize chaos as much as possible so that in those moments of true chaos and danger, we can operate, right? That's not needed out here. Like, there is no such thing as what right looks like. People think, like, we are so trained to think, okay, there's a rank chart, right? Like, I'm used to going up and to the right. I want to go from lieutenant to captain to major, whatever, right? Like, the ultimate success, you're a 4-star in the White House as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, right? Like, there's a top to this pyramid. Like, there's no pyramids out here. Like, there are some career paths. Like, if you want to be a consultant, then you go be a partner or whatever. Like, but ultimately, you can find yourself standing on top of that pyramid and you realize that's not actually the top of the pyramid. Right? And so I would just really challenge people to think, like, abolish the concept of what right looks like from your vocabulary when you're thinking about getting out, right? Of course, keep it while you're in, because you want to be successful during your military career. But success looks different to everybody, right? To some people, their faith might be the most important thing. And so they should go find a faith community that they're going to feel enriched by and fulfilled by and connected to. And like, they don't, that at that point, then they're just subject to the whims of the economy in that area to figure out what their profession should be, right? For other people, like their job is so core to their identity. Like that's me. I have to really, really care about what I do, right? And almost everything else for me is fungible. Like we spend the majority of our lives, at least right now during this phase of my life, doing work.
Yep, work.
I can't just do that for a paycheck. Like I really have to care. And so
Yep.
to me, like the top of the mountain is like the
Being
voice inside
connected
of me that knows
Yeah.
I actually care to get out of bed and do this work, right?
Yeah.
Everyone defines that differently. Some people might, who the hell knows? You might come from an immigrant family and like your role is to make as much money and ship it back home and take care of your family and everything else. Like go for the cash grab, man. Like that's what right looks like for you, right?
Yeah.
And so that's just ultimately, I think it's taken me 12 years and I still wrestle with this. But that's probably the biggest thing that I've had to learn is that notion of patience with yourself really is that acceptance that like there's no right answer, there's no race, no one's winning, no one's losing. Like, do whatever you perceive to be the things that you need to take care of yourself, your family, your relationships, your sense of motivation, your spirituality, of your physical fitness, your health, whatever it is, like optimize for that and you'll feel fine. And like it won't matter at all what your rank is or who you work for or whatever. There's this thing, if you just Google the term wellness wheel, there's like this concept that like there's like there's like a pie chart of like all the things that go into actually truly making us feel whole. That's what you should be optimizing for, not some external definition of this is what right looks like.
Yeah.
Right? So if I've got final wisdom, I guess that's it to share. And I don't share that as someone who's figured that out or truly answered that. It's something I personally still wrestle with.
It's an ongoing journey. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Dan, well, this conversation, I know people will go back and listen to because you dropped so many good little nuggets along the way. Like I'm sure Amanda, our podcast producer, is just like taking notes of like where to just be able to circle back and highlight. So thank you so much for sharing and letting us in your brain. This is clearly a topic that you're passionate. See you soon.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Resources with us for our listeners to put in the show notes. But Dan, thank you so much for letting us into your world, for, enlightening our listeners about things they can be taking into consideration as they consider transitioning, or if they're, mid-transition and kind of wondering what's next. So thank you.
Well, it's my honor. It's my pleasure. I love the work that you guys do. I think that, helping people reach higher with their goals in terms of, between you guys and the Warrior Scholar Project, I'm like, you guys are where it's at, man. Like you're doing the right work. And it just means so much to me to be able to give back in some minor way. I gave you an hour of my time. I didn't really do much for you, but I thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
For sure. Well, thanks again. And we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks.
That's it for this episode. Join us next week, same time, same place, where we share more Service to School stories. Service to School Stories is hosted by Sydney Mathis, the Director of Student Success, and produced by Amanda DeBias, the Director of Communication at Service to School. Service to School is a 501c3 nonprofit providing free college admission support to transitioning service members and veterans. Join us next time and follow us for more on all of your favorite social media platforms.